I remember the night everything shattered. The night I walked in and caught my younger son tangled in a sin I could not have imagined in my darkest nightmares. He was in bed with his own wife's mother, his mother-in-law. My body froze, my voice stuck in my throat, and my heart felt like it was being ripped apart. The room smelled of betrayal, of sweat, of something unholy that no mother should ever witness from her child. For a few seconds I thought maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe it was the dim light. Maybe I was dreaming. But then I heard her laugh, that low, satisfied chuckle that made my skin crawl, and I saw my son looking at her, not with shame, but with desire. I couldn't scream. I couldn't cry. I just stood there, watching the ruin of my family unravel before my eyes. If you're liking our stories, support us by subscribing to our channel. When they saw me, their faces changed. She pulled the sheet over herself, eyes widening in something between fear and arrogance. My son, he didn't even look ashamed. He just looked at me like I was intruding, like I was the one who had crossed a boundary. My hands shook so badly that I grabbed the door frame just to keep myself standing. My voice cracked as I whispered his name, begging silently for him to tell me this wasn't real. But silence was the answer, and silence was louder than any confession. I stumbled backward, and I don't remember how I ended up outside the house, gasping for air as if I'd been underwater. My chest hurt, and my tears burned as they rolled down. The betrayal wasn't just his, it was hers too. A mother-in-law, someone meant to guide and protect, not seduce and destroy. I wanted to scream to the heavens, to curse them both. But the night was quiet, and my pain felt swallowed by the darkness. The next morning, everything exploded. Her husband, my son's father-in-law, found out. I don't even know how. Maybe she confessed. Maybe my son told her husband in some twisted attempt at honesty. Or maybe the guilt leaked out in careless whispers. But when that man stormed into my home, his face red with fury, his fists clenched like weapons, I knew blood would be spilled that day. He shouted, cursed, and lunged at my son with a rage I had never seen in another man's eyes. I threw myself between them, screaming for them to stop. But it was like trying to hold back a flood with bare hands. He wanted to kill my son, and I believed for a moment that maybe he should. The shame, the sin, the filth, it clung to my boy like a second skin. But he was still my son, my flesh, my blood, and I couldn't let him be beaten to death. The neighbors gathered, whispers spreading faster than fire, and suddenly our family's shame wasn't just inside our walls. It was on every tongue in the street. Her husband spat in my face, saying my son had ruined his home, his marriage, his honor. Then, in a voice so dark it sent chills down my spine, he said if he couldn't kill my son, he'd do something worse. He'd take me instead. His eyes scanned me like a predator, and for the first time in my life I felt like prey in my own home. I screamed for help, but everyone just stared, frozen in the madness of it all. That night I locked every door, every window, but sleep refused to come. My son sat in silence, head hung low, while his wife wept in the corner, betrayed by both her husband and her mother. Our home became a graveyard of broken trust, each breath heavy with anger and fear. Then came the knock on the door. The police. Someone had called them. Maybe a neighbor who heard the fight. Maybe even her husband himself. They stepped into the chaos, their uniforms like a final judgment on our sins. Questions, accusations, threats. It all blurred into one long nightmare. The shame of speaking it aloud burned me more than the betrayal itself. How could I tell them what my son had done? How could I say the words, "My son slept with his mother-in-law," without feeling like my heart was being ripped from my chest? But the truth was already out, and lies couldn't bury it anymore. The police warned that the matter could escalate, that bloodshed was likely if something wasn't resolved. They asked me if I wanted to press charges, if I wanted protection, but all I wanted was to wake up from the nightmare. My son sat there silent, broken, or maybe just pretending. His wife couldn't look at him. Her mother had disappeared, slinking away like the snake she was, leaving nothing behind but wreckage. But the story didn't end there. In fact, that was just the beginning of the storm that would swallow us whole. After the police left that night, the silence in our house was unbearable. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, each second drilling into my skull like a reminder of how broken everything was. My son sat hunched over at the table, his face buried in his hands. His wife sat in the corner, rocking herself back and forth like a child who had just lost her world. And me. I stood by the window staring out into the darkness, wondering how life could twist itself into something so cruel, so unrecognizable. The very next day, her husband returned. This time he wasn't screaming. He was calm, too calm, and that terrified me more than his rage. His voice was low, controlled, but his eyes carried murder. He said, "If I can't kill your son, I'll destroy everything you love. I'll take your dignity, I'll take your peace, and I'll make sure you beg me for mercy." And then he leaned closer, his breath hot and foul on my face, and whispered words that made my stomach turn. "Maybe I'll have you. That way, your son will know the pain of watching someone he loves be taken." I shoved him away, but the way he looked at me lingered, crawling over my skin like fire ants. My son jumped to his feet, ready to fight, but I held him back. One more violent clash, and the police wouldn't just warn us. They would take someone away in handcuffs, or worse, in a body bag. My neighbors were watching from their windows, their faces pressed to the glass like vultures circling a dying animal. Our shame was their entertainment. That night, my son's wife packed her things. She couldn't stay. Her mother had disappeared. Her marriage was shattered, and every glance at my son made her sob harder. She left with nothing but a bag and her broken heart. I didn't stop her. What could I say? What could I do? My son had burned every bridge, and I could only watch as the ashes fell around us. But the husband didn't stop. He started following me. I would go to the market and feel his eyes on me, standing a few steps away, his smirk cutting into me like a knife. At night I would hear footsteps outside my window, slow, deliberate, as if he wanted me to know he was there. My chest tightened with fear every time, but I refused to show weakness. I refused to let him see me crumble. Then, one evening, he forced his way into my home. My son wasn't there. He had gone out, maybe to drink, maybe to escape the mess he'd created. I was alone. The man locked the door behind him, his eyes gleaming with the kind of hunger that made my stomach churn. He said, "You think you can protect him? You think you can stop me? Tonight you'll understand what it feels like to lose everything." My heart pounded so loud I thought it would burst out of my chest. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy iron pan, and held it in front of me. My hands were shaking, my legs weak, but I stood my ground. He lunged and I swung with all my strength. The sound of metal crashing against bone filled the room, followed by his scream. He stumbled back, clutching his head, blood trickling through his fingers. And that's when my son walked in. He saw the man bleeding, me trembling with the pan in my hands, and without hesitation, he attacked. They crashed into each other like wild animals, fists flying, curses tearing through the air. Blood smeared the floor, their grunts and groans filling the room with chaos. I screamed for them to stop, but they didn't hear me. It was as if the devil himself had taken over my house. The neighbors called the police again. By the time the officers arrived, both men were covered in blood, their breaths ragged, their bodies trembling from exhaustion. The officers pulled them apart, forcing them down, handcuffing them both. I tried to explain, tried to beg them to listen. But all they saw was a crime scene. 2 men trying to kill each other, a woman sobbing in the middle of it all. At the station, I told them everything. I told them about the affair, the betrayal, the threats, the stalking. The officers exchanged glances, their faces grim. One of them said, "Ma'am, this is more than just a family dispute. This is dangerous. Someone's going to end up dead if this continues." They offered me protection, a restraining order, but what could paper do against a man filled with vengeance? Days turned into weeks, and the weight of shame pressed heavier on my shoulders. My son avoided me, drowning himself in silence. He couldn't face what he had done, and I couldn't look at him without remembering that night. But despite everything, he was still my child. My love for him battled my anger every single day. And then came the twist I never saw coming. The husband, the man who wanted to destroy my son, was found dead in his home. The police said it looked like a heart attack, but rumors spread like wildfire. Some whispered it was suicide, others said it was karma, and a few even dared to suggest my son had something to do with it. I didn't know what to believe. All I knew was that one chapter of this nightmare had ended, but the scars it left would never heal. My neighbors still look at me with pity, some with disgust. Whispers follow me wherever I go. My family name is stained, my son is broken, and I am left to pick up the shattered pieces of a life that will never be whole again. When the papers were signed, when I walked out of the court with freedom clutched in my trembling hands, I did not return to the house that had been my prison. Instead, I took his hand, the man who had stood by me, who had fought for me in front of the world, and together we built something new. The whispers only grew louder when, on the very same day my son became a husband, I too stood before witnesses and pledged myself to a man. Mother and son, 2 weddings, one under the weight of tradition and expectation, the other under the fire of scandal and defiance. People said I had ruined my son's life, tainted his wedding, brought disgrace upon the family. Perhaps I did, but I also saved myself, and sometimes survival looks like sin to those who never dared to fight for their own lives. The days that followed were not easy. My son's eyes grew distant, caught between the love he bore me and the shame society forced upon him. My new marriage was not celebrated with garlands and blessings, but with curses and judgment. Yet, in the quiet of our home, when my husband, my true husband, not the tyrant I divorced, held me close and whispered that I mattered, I knew I had chosen right. For once I had lived not for them, not for reputation, not for silence, but for myself. And if the world never forgave me, I would still walk with my head high, because I had finally learned to love the woman staring back at me in the mirror. The first night after the court stamped my divorce papers, silence filled the room. Not the silence I had known before, heavy and suffocating, but a silence that breathed. I sat on the edge of the bed in my new home, fingers trembling as they brushed across the crisp sheets, and I realized This silence was mine. No footsteps thundering down the hall. No harsh voice ready to find fault in whatever I did. No clenched fists waiting for the smallest mistake. My husband, the man who had once been my captor, was gone from my life. Yet freedom did not feel like fireworks or celebration. It felt fragile, like a glass in my hands that could shatter with the smallest slip. The neighbors had already begun their whispers. Women outside my gate slowed their steps, their eyes heavy with judgment. Men muttered about how I had shamed the family name, how I had destroyed my son's respect in society. Even my relatives distanced themselves, treating me like a disease that might spread to their daughters. But none of them came when my body was black and blue, when I hid my face with powder to cover the bruises, when I swallowed my cries so the children wouldn't hear. They had left me to suffer then, so why should I let their words poison me now? Still, it hurt. At the market, when I bought vegetables, vendors exchanged looks, mocking smirks cutting deeper than knives. At weddings, when women gathered in circles of laughter, the moment I stepped near, their voices would drop, and their eyes would pierce me like daggers. I became a story they told each other to feel better about their own cages. At least we're not like her, they must have whispered. But at night, when the world quieted and my new husband, my true companion, sat beside me, I felt the warmth of something I had long been denied. Gentleness. His hands never raised in anger. His words never sharpened into knives. Instead, he listened. He asked about my day. He cared about my thoughts. And in that care, I found pieces of myself I thought had died years ago. Yet not everything healed. My son, the child I had carried, the boy whose scraped knees I once kissed better, looked at me with eyes that were no longer soft. He avoided my calls, kept his visits short, and when he did come, he barely met my gaze. The distance was worse than any beating I had endured. I could survive society's cruelty, but the silence of my son gnawed at me like an endless hunger. I had chosen freedom, but in doing so, had I lost him forever? One evening I gathered the courage to visit him. His bride greeted me with forced politeness, her smile tight and cold. The house smelled of fresh paint and jasmine, a new life he was building, a life I felt like an intruder in. My son sat stiffly on the sofa, his eyes on the floor. I tried to speak, to explain, to tell him that I had suffered for him, that I had chosen life for myself after decades of death. But the words caught in my throat when I saw the shadow in his face. Finally he spoke, his voice low and cutting. "Ami, you could have waited. You could have let my wedding pass. You didn't have to make it about you." The words struck harder than any slap ever had. I wanted to scream that it wasn't about me, that it was about survival, that if I hadn't stood up then, I might never have found the courage again. But I saw it in his eyes. Society had already poisoned him. To him I was not a survivor. I was a disgrace. I swallowed my tears and left, my body heavy, my heart a stone sinking in an endless sea. Days turned to months, and the storm did not calm. My ex-husband poisoned relatives against me, spinning stories that painted me as a sinner, a selfish woman who had destroyed her family for lust. No one wanted to hear my truth. They only wanted to protect the comfort of their own lies. Yet through it all, my husband stood firm beside me. He told me that survival was never meant to be easy, that choosing love in a world built on fear would always come with scars. He told me that one day my son would understand, even if today he could not. But the nights were long. Sometimes I would sit by the window, watching the world move on, wondering if I had chosen wrong. Was freedom worth losing, my son? Was love worth the hatred of society? Yet when I closed my eyes and remembered the fists, the broken glass, the silent sobs on the cold floor of my old home, I knew the answer. Yes. Freedom was worth it. Love was worth it. My life was worth it. Years passed. Slowly the whispers grew quieter. New scandals replaced my story in the mouths of gossiping women. My son, still distant, began to soften with time, though the wall between us never fully crumbled. But when I held my grandchild for the first time, tiny fingers wrapping around mine, tears spilled down my cheeks. In that moment I felt the cycle breaking. This child would not grow up in a house where fists replaced words, where silence drowned screams. This child would know love, real love, because I had chosen it for myself. And maybe, just maybe, one day my son would look at me and not see shame, but strength. Maybe he would understand that his mother was not weak, that she had fought a war few dared to fight, and that she had won. Money. That was the next battlefield. When I walked out of that house, I didn't just leave behind a husband. I left behind years of financial dependency, control, and manipulation. He had always made sure I had no access to the accounts, no knowledge of where the money flowed. My earnings, my savings from sewing clothes for neighbors, from tutoring children in the evenings. He had snatched all of it slowly, under the pretense of family responsibility. I walked out with nothing but a suitcase, a few clothes, and a bruised soul. My new husband was supportive, but he too was not rich. He worked hard, lived with dignity, but carried no fortune in his pockets. We rented a modest house, small enough that I could hear the echo of my own footsteps in every room. The walls were cracked, the paint chipped, but for me it was a palace, because no one raised a hand in anger there. Still, peace did not fill the stomach. Food had to be bought, bills had to be paid, and slowly the weight of survival pressed on my shoulders again. I went back to the skills I had once been mocked for. Needle and thread became my weapons. I stitched late into the nights, fingers bleeding at times, eyes burning under the weak glow of a single bulb. Word spread among women in the neighborhood. They came with fabrics, designs, hopes of looking beautiful in clothes made by my hands. I poured my soul into every stitch, as if sewing my broken life back together. My husband helped, carrying bundles to the bazaar, bargaining for thread, even delivering finished clothes when my legs swelled too much to walk. But society wasn't kind. The same women who brought me work whispered behind my back. She divorced her husband and married again. Can we trust her with our clothes? What kind of woman is she? Their words stung, but I never let my hands stop moving, because I knew. Silence could not feed me, but determination could. My son heard these whispers too. When he visited, he avoided looking at the sewing machine in the corner. Once he even muttered, "You've lowered yourself, Ami. Couldn't you just live quietly instead of parading your disgrace?" My throat tightened, but I didn't argue. How could I make him understand that dignity wasn't in silence? It was in survival. Days turned into weeks, weeks into years. Slowly the little business grew. Women who once mocked me began praising my designs. Orders came in bulk. I trained 2 young girls from the neighborhood. Girls whose fathers wanted to marry them off at 14. Teaching them gave me more than money. It gave me purpose. Their laughter filled the small house. Their dreams became mine. And for the first time, I felt I was planting seeds for a better future. But every step forward had shadows. My ex-husband, bitter and vengeful, spread lies in the community. He told people I was still meeting other men, that my second marriage was a sin, that my business was nothing but a cover for immorality. Some believed him. Customers canceled orders. Friends turned their backs. The cruelty of his voice carried further than the strength of my hands.